What's up, everyone? Today we're taking a look at a whole bunch of topics. We got the Red Scare, the Palmer Raids, attacks on civil liberties, a rise in nativism, and a whole lot more. We're covering America 1914 to the 1920s. So what's the big idea? Hit it, Drake. Official restrictions on freedom of speech grew during World War I, as increased anxiety about radicalism led to a Red Scare and attacks on labor activism and immigrant culture. So let's break down this statement first. How was freedom of speech being restricted during the war? Well, there's a couple of laws you should know about. The first one is the Espionage Act of 1917. It made it a crime to interfere with military operations or recruitment. So you couldn't obstruct the draft. You couldn't get people to try to avoid the draft during World War I. The other law in 1918, the Sedition Act banned anybody from criticizing the U.S. government. You couldn't make any disloyal or abusive remarks against the U.S. government. And it's important to note, to understand these two laws during World War I, you have to understand the context of this time period. There was a lot of anti-German sentiment. It had increased during the war. Remember, before the war, there was a lot of fear of immigrants, especially those new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Well, during World War I, it was
the Germans
that bore the brunt of this increased nativism. Now, for those of you that are wondering, how can they pass the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act? Isn't that against the First Amendment for the government to tell you not to speak? Well, there was a court case and the Supreme Court ruled that the government can in fact tell citizens, don't speak.
Don't speak, don't speak, don't speak.
In the Supreme Court case of Schenck versus the United States, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Espionage Act. Basically, the court ruled Congress had the power to restrain speech if it posed a clear and present danger. And in the court's opinion, Charles Schenck, by distributing pamphlets against the draft, was posing a clear and present danger. Therefore, his speech could be limited by the government. Now, World War I ends, and following World War I, remember, America turns inward. They're exhausted by the fighting. Many Americans are disillusioned with the war. Why did we fight this thing? There was a bitter debate over the League of Nations, and many Americans wanted to be isolationists, turn inward away from world affairs. But the fear of the Germans during World War I is replaced with a new fear of radicals, communism, and revolution following World War I, and this is going to be the Red Scare. So how does this occur? This fear of revolution is fueled by the fact during World War I, the Communist Party came to power in Russia. This is the Bolshevik Revolution. Eventually, Lenin assumes control of what will become the Soviet Union. There's a small Communist Party in the United States. It's not very big, not very influential, but one of the goals of this new communist country, Russia, was to have a worldwide revolution, to spread communism and to overthrow capitalism. And so for many Americans, there was this tremendous fear that this could happen now that Russia has gone the communist way. Now, a completely unrelated event happens actually within the United States starting in 1919, and that is with workers.
Just whistle while you work.
Well, the whistling stops because strikes occurred throughout the United States, started in 1919 throughout the country. Most of these strikes are peaceful, and workers are angry over low wages and working conditions. And keep in mind, there was a lot of anti-labor sentiment. We saw this during the Gilded Age, but it had lessened during the progressive movement, and workers had sacrificed during World War I, and they want a little bit higher wages and better working conditions. Strikes occur in all sorts of industries. You have the Great Steel Strike in 1919 that starts off, and they're seeking higher pay. It's a peaceful strike, but federal troops are called in. No violence takes place at the steel strike. Another major strike takes place in Boston. This time the police go on strike, and once again, once the strike takes place, the National Guard is sent in and the strike is busted up. And what happens as a result of these strikes is these two separate events the Russia turning communist and the strikes occurring after World War I are kind of linked together. Many people in the public see the strikes as the work of radicals seeking revolution and trying to overthrow capitalism. And so many of these labor unions are kind of deemed as red or communist. And public opinion is going to be very much against these unions and these strikes. Now, it's important to note, it's not really these strikes that cause the fear of revolution. It's something entirely different that happens in the same year, 1919, and that is bombs go off in about 8 American cities. Bombs start going off. They start being sent to various government agencies by the mail. These are unexplained bombings, most likely the work of Italian anarchists. And these bombs going off cause a huge amount of fear. And the fear was this must be the start of a communist revolutionary plot. The bombs don't stop in 1919. In fact, fear increased when a bomb went off at Wall Street in 1920 as well. 38 people are killed, and all of these events, the bombs going off in 1919, trigger what is known as the Red Scare, which will take place from 1919 to 1920. The Red Scare is a fear that America was going to experience a communist or radical takeover. Now, what ends up happening during the Red Scare is the U.S. government begins rounding up, looking for, and arresting you, and you. You and me, we just don't get along. The government does not get along with these groups. In fact, there was a nationwide fear of radicals, leftists, socialists, anarchists, communists. Anybody kind of who was deemed radical was kind of looked upon with suspicion, and this included labor leaders who very often were not communist or radical or socialist, and immigrants as well, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe. In response to the Red Scare, you get something called the Palmer Raids taking place. They're named after the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. He led raids of suspected radicals, all those people you saw on the list on the previous slide. Palmer creates a special office led by J. Edgar Hoover, and during the Palmer raids, free speech and other civil liberties suffered. There is widespread searching of private homes, offices. People are put in jail without legal counsel. There's illegal warrants, and thousands of Americans are arrested. Many of these just because of their association with so-called radical ideas, or if they advocated for labor rights, they might then get in trouble. Dissenting views were oftentimes seen as un-American, and these Palmer raids rounded up anybody who was deemed radical or dangerous. In fact, not only that, people who were democratically elected were denied their seats. These men were elected to the New York Assembly, and all of them, even though they won the election democratically, they were denied their seat. This fear and hysteria increased into 1920, and some immigrants were deported without trial. The most famous story happens with the USS Bufford, which was nicknamed the Soviet Ark. There were 249 suspected radicals forcibly deported, including the famous radical Emma Goldman. So these Palmer raids really target people very often who had done nothing wrong, but because of their political beliefs or their perceived political beliefs. Now, by mid-1920, the hysteria came to an end. You know, Palmer was talking about there was going to be some big attack in May of 1920. It never happens. In fact, they don't really turn up any evidence of widespread revolutionary conspiracy. Most likely, these bombs were the work of some small anarchist groups, and things kind of calm down, and the Palmer raids come to an end. However, this leads us to our second big idea of today. During and after World War I, nativist campaigns against some ethnic groups led to the passage of quotas that restricted immigration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, and increased barriers to Asian immigrants. So let's break this down really quickly. And what you're going to see is in the 1920s, increased support for restricting immigration. Now, this is a huge contrast from the period before World War I, where immigration from Europe, at least, reached its peak. There was huge numbers of people coming into the country, coming in through Ellis Island. Well, that's all going to come to an end in the 1920s. Here's what happens. A Quota Act is passed, which basically tells immigrants, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe, get out. Actually, not really get out. It sets up a quota. The Quota Act of 1921 limited immigration, the number of immigrants, to 3% of those living in the U.S. as of 1910. Another Quota Act is passed, which also told immigrants, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe, get out. And the National Quota Act of 1924, or sometimes the National Origins Act, set the quota at 2% of the immigrants in the U.S. in 1890. And they switched the date from 1910 to 1890 because in 1890 there were fewer of those so-called new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the purpose of the National Quota Act of 1924 was to deny entry, to limit the number of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe allowed to come into the United States. And if you take a look at the blue on these pie charts, you could see it was very successful at doing that. Another part of the Quota Act of 1924 dealt with denying Japanese immigrants entry into the United States. The Quota Act severely restricted Asian immigration. It actually said no Japanese immigration at all. And recall, this is nothing new because we did pass previously, the first time in our history, an act that was designed to exclude a particular ethnic group with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. These laws were designed to keep out those immigrants considered undesirable. The immigration tide was now cut off or severely restricted, and it's within this kind of anti-immigrant nativist political climate you have the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti are convicted of robbery and murder in 1921, and during the trial, much of the evidence was not really focused on these two crimes, but rather the fact that they were Italian immigrants, they were anarchists, and they were draft dodgers during World War I, and many people considered the case of Sacco and Vanzetti representing this rise of nativism that was characteristic of the 1920s. Alright, that's going to do it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Hit pause and analyze this political cartoon and go a little bit deeper into the content. But until next time, make sure you click like on the video, subscribe, and tell all of your friends. Have a beautiful day. Peace.